Oscar stood frozen, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth beneath him. His hands hung limply at his sides, his fingers twitching as smoke curled into the night sky. His cabin, his escape from everything, was gone, just blackened beams and scattered embers. He took a shaky breath. The sharp smell of burnt wood and melted plastic clung to the air, stinging his eyes. Jacob's hand rested on his shoulder. "Oscar!" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Oscar's throat tightened. He couldn't take his eyes off the wreckage. The porch swing where he'd once sat with his dad, drinking coffee and watching the sun rise, gone. The weathered bookshelf packed with old paperbacks his mom had given him, gone. Everything that made this place was now reduced to ash. "Fire marshal said it was suspicious," Jacob murmured. Oscar's jaw twitched. Suspicious. He didn't need an investigation to know what had happened. Margaret Elwood, the Fairview Shores HOA. He could almost hear her cold, clipped tone. It wasn't enough that she'd harassed him with fines and threats. Now she'd taken this. Oscar's hands curled into fists at his sides. His heart pounded in his ears. "They did this," he said, his voice low and steady. Jacob shifted beside him. "You really think?" "I know it." Oscar's eyes darkened as he stepped forward, the heat from the embers warming his face. His chest heaved, his jaw clenched. "They wanted a fight?" he whispered. "Well, now they've got one." It had all started with a letter. Oscar had been sorting through his mail one morning when he saw the crisp white envelope marked with the Fairview Shores HOA logo. He frowned, setting down his coffee mug before tearing it open. The letter was typed neatly, almost polite in its wording. But the message was clear. "You owe $3,200 for golf course maintenance fees." Oscar's eyebrows shot up. He laughed. He didn't even live in the HOA. His cabin sat just outside the boundary line. He had no reason, no obligation, to pay for a golf course he didn't use. He picked up his phone and dialed the number listed on the letter. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Oscar." Margaret Elwood's voice was smooth and controlled. "I was wondering when you'd call." "Margaret," Oscar said, his tone sharp. "My cabin isn't part of your HOA. I don't owe you a dime." Margaret's pause was deliberate. "Oscar, the golf course is for the enjoyment of the entire community. It's only fair that everyone contributes." "I don't use your golf course," Oscar snapped. Margaret sighed dramatically. "That's unfortunate," she said. "It would be a shame if your property were found to be non-compliant." Oscar's eyes narrowed. That sounded an awful lot like a threat. "Oh, of course not," Margaret said, her tone dripping with sweetness. "Just a friendly reminder that we take community standards very seriously." Oscar's jaw tightened. "You're not getting a penny from me." Margaret's tone sharpened. "We'll see." Oscar hung up, his hands shaking. He knew Margaret had a history of bullying homeowners into compliance. But this time, she'd overplayed her hand. She had no idea who she was dealing with. A week later, the fines started arriving. Oscar pulled open his mailbox to find a stack of HOA notices. He flipped through them. Excessive vegetation, failure to maintain community standards, improper building materials. Oscar's eyes narrowed. His cabin had been in perfect condition. These fines were nonsense. He grabbed a red marker and scrawled across each one. "Not in your HOA. Stop harassing me." He shoved them back into an envelope and dropped it in the mail. But the harassment didn't stop. A few days later, he noticed movement on his security cameras. Two men in dark jackets were standing near his property, taking pictures. Oscar stormed outside. "Hey!" The men froze. One of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, lowered his camera and smiled faintly. "Just conducting a routine inspection," he said. "You're on private property." Oscar shot back. "Get off my land." The other man smirked. "Margaret's not going to like this." Oscar's jaw tightened. "Tell Margaret I'm not backing down." The men exchanged a glance before turning and walking away. Oscar stood there, his fists clenched as he watched them disappear down the road. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. And Margaret wanted him under her thumb. But Oscar wasn't bending. Oscar was halfway asleep when his phone rang. He groaned and rolled over. glancing at the screen. Jacob's name flashed. "What's up?" Oscar mumbled. "Oscar." Jacob's voice was sharp and frantic. "Your cabin, there's a fire." Oscar shot upright. "What?" "I'm looking at it right now. Get over here." Oscar didn't even put on shoes. He grabbed his keys and bolted for his truck. The engine roared as he tore down the highway, his heart hammering. By the time he reached the cabin, the sky was lit with an angry orange glow. Fire trucks lined the road. Flames roared through the structure, licking at the night sky. Oscar jumped out his truck and stumbled toward the scene. "Sir." A firefighter grabbed his arm. "You can't go any closer." "That's my home." Oscar shouted. "It's too late," the firefighter said, pulling him back. Oscar's eyes widened as the roof caved in, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Jacob ran toward him, breathless. "They said it's suspicious," Jacob said. "No storms. No electrical issues." Oscar's mind raced. The fines. The threats. The trespassers. "They did this," Oscar said, his voice cold. "Margaret did this." Jacob's expression darkened. "Oscar, you need to call someone." Oscar's gaze hardened. "I'm not calling anyone." Jacob frowned. "What are you going to do?" Oscar's eyes narrowed as he watched the last of the flames die out. "I'm going to make sure they pay for this." The next morning, Oscar marched into the Fairview Shores HOA office. The receptionist looked up in alarm. "Mr. Carter, you can't." Oscar ignored her and pushed open the boardroom doors. Margaret was seated at the head of the table, flanked by the other board members. She smiled thinly. "Oscar," Margaret said calmly, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" Oscar tossed a folder onto the table. "My cabin burned down last night." Margaret's smile didn't waver. "That's terrible news. I'm sure the fire department will get to the bottom of it." Oscar leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "My security cameras caught your people on my property before the fire, and the fire marshal already called it suspicious." Margaret's smile thinned. "That's quite the accusation." Oscar's eyes darkened. "It's not an accusation. It's a fact." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Oscar straightened. His pulse pounded in his ears. "I'm not suggesting anything," he said. "I'm telling you this is war." Oscar sat across from Damian Winter in a sleek downtown office. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the city traffic below. Damian's office was all dark wood and leather, the kind of place that made you feel like you were sitting across from someone who knew exactly how to dismantle an opponent, piece by piece. Damian was tall and sharp-featured, with a quiet intensity that made you feel like he was 5 steps ahead of you in any conversation. He flipped through the stack of documents Oscar had handed him. Property deeds, security camera stills, and copies of the fines Margaret had been sending him. "Wow!" Damian muttered. He set the papers down and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. They really thought they could get away with this? Oscar's hands rested on his knees. His jaw tightened. They've been doing this for years. Margaret's been bleeding people dry, but no one's ever pushed back hard enough. Damian's dark eyes studied him. But burning down your house? That's not just extortion, that's personal. Oscar's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, and I'm done playing defense." Damian nodded slowly. "We've got enough here to file a civil suit. But if you want this to stick, if you want criminal charges, we need more." Oscar's brow furrowed. "More? We need something direct," Damian said. "Proof that Margaret or someone on her payroll was behind the fire. The security footage of those board members snooping around is helpful, but it's not enough." Oscar's jaw clenched. His mind was already racing. He knew there was more to uncover. He just needed the right person to help him find it. "I know where to start," Oscar said quietly. Damian's gaze sharpened. "Good." Oscar stood, his pulse steady despite the storm building inside him. "Margaret's used to people folding under pressure. She's never dealt with someone like me." A small smile touched Damian's lips. "Then let's make sure this time she loses." The next morning, Oscar pulled into Jacob's driveway. The old pickup truck in front of the house was caked with mud, and Jacob himself answered the door in a worn flannel shirt. holding a steaming mug of coffee. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Jacob said, stepping aside to let him in. Oscar followed him into the house. Jacob's living room was cluttered but warm. Stacks of old newspapers on a coffee table, a half-finished jigsaw puzzle on the sideboard. But the thing that caught Oscar's eye was a corkboard on the wall. Pinned to it were dozens of documents, HOA notices, fee breakdowns, and complaint letters. Some of the papers were yellowed with age. "You've been tracking this?" Oscar asked, walking toward the board. Jacob set down his mug. "Margaret's been running the scam for years. Fining people for the tiniest things, unapproved plants, slightly mismatched paint on their mailboxes, then funneling that money into community accounts." He made air quotes. "Except those accounts are Margaret's personal slush fund." Oscar turned toward him. "Why didn't you say anything?" Jacob sighed. "People were scared. Oscar, the HOA hold a lot of power around here. Margaret can make your life miserable." Oscar's jaw tightened. "She already has." Jacob walked over to a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. He handed it to Oscar. "I've been collecting proof," Jacob said. "Financial records, misplaced funds, and—" He hesitated before pulling a USB drive from his pocket. "I may have hacked into the HOA security system." Oscar raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" Jacob smiled faintly. "Desperate times." Oscar plugged the USB into his laptop and clicked through the files. His breath caught when he saw it. A grainy black and white video showing two figures sneaking onto his property. One held a gas canister. The other struck a match. Oscar's chest tightened. His hands curled into fists. Jacob's voice was quiet. "That's them." Oscar's eyes darkened. "We've got them." Jacob crossed his arms. "So what's next?" Oscar's gaze sharpened. "We make sure they regret it." Later that evening, Oscar sat across from Damien in the lawyer's office. The room was dim except for the soft glow of the laptop screen. Damien watched the footage closely. When the figure lit the match, Damien's mouth pressed into a thin line. "This changes everything," Damien said. "We've got them at the scene of the crime." Oscar slid the folder of financial records across the table. "It gets better." Damien flipped through the pages. His expression darkened. They were siphoning HOA funds through fake maintenance projects. Damien's lips curled slightly. "Bold." "Margaret's name is all over those records," Oscar said. "It's not just financial misconduct, it's fraud." Damien's smile sharpened. "This is bigger than I thought." Oscar's fist tightened. "So what do we do?" Damien closed the laptop. "We hit them with a civil suit tomorrow. The criminal charges will come next. Once the other board members realize Margaret's going down, they'll flip to save themselves." Oscar exhaled. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just about the fire anymore. Margaret had built an empire of control and intimidation, and it was about to collapse. "You think they'll talk?" Oscar asked. Damien smiled faintly. "They always do." The next morning, Oscar stood on the steps of the county courthouse. Damien stood beside him, a thick folder of paperwork under his arm. "You ready for this?" Damien asked. Oscar's jaw tightened. "I've been ready since the night they burned down my cabin." They walked through the courthouse doors together. An hour later, the lawsuit was filed. Oscar's phone buzzed as they walked out. It was Jacob. "They're panicking," Jacob said. "Margaret just called an emergency board meeting." Oscar smiled. "Good." That afternoon, Oscar walked into the Fairview Shores HOA office. The board members were seated around a long table. Margaret stood at the head, her arms crossed. She straightened when she saw him. "Oscar, what a surprise." Oscar dropped a thick envelope onto the table. "You've been served." Margaret's brow lifted slightly as she opened the envelope. Her smile faded as she scanned the contents. "This is absurd," she said. "You can't possibly think." Oscar leaned forward. "Don't worry. You'll see the evidence in court." Margaret's smile tightened. "You have no idea what you're starting." Oscar's eyes narrowed. "Neither do you." It didn't take long for fallout to begin. A week later, the sheriff's department showed up at the HOA office with a warrant. Oscar stood across the street, watching as officers carried out boxes of files and computers. Margaret stood on the sidewalk, her arms crossed. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. "You think this will ruin me?" she said, her voice low. Oscar's expression didn't change. "I don't think. I know." Just then, Damien walked over, holding a thick file. The financial audit confirmed everything. Damien said quietly, "Fraud, embezzlement, misuse of HOA funds." Margaret's attorney whispered something in her ear. Margaret's eyes darkened. "She's losing control," Damien said. Oscar's lips curled into a thin smile. "Good." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "You think you won?" Oscar's eyes didn't waver. "I'm just getting started." Margaret's attorney touched her arm, leading her away as the officers loaded the last of the evidence into their van. Oscar's chest rose and fell steadily. Jacob appeared beside him. "Think she'll fold?" Jacob asked. Oscar's smile was cold. "She won't have a choice." Oscar sat in the front row of the courtroom, his hands resting on his knees. His heart hammered in his chest, but his face remained calm. He wasn't nervous. He was focused. Rows of Fairview Shores residents sat behind him, their quiet murmurs filling the air. Some of them had been victims of the HOA's overreach, fined for everything from mailbox colors to the height of their grass. Now, they were here to see if justice would finally be served. Damien sat beside him, cool and composed as ever. He leaned toward Oscar. "You ready?" Oscar's jaw tightened. "I've been ready." The judge walked in, and the chatter immediately died down. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Oscar stood, his eyes steady. Across the room, Margaret Elwood sat at the defendant's table. She was dressed immaculately, her tailored blazer crisp and perfect. But Oscar noticed the way her hands gripped the table a little too tightly, how her jaw twitched slightly as the judge took her seat. "Mr. Winter," the judge said, "you may proceed." Damien stood smoothly, holding a remote in one hand and a thick file in the other. "Your Honor," Damien began, "we intend to show that Margaret Elwood and the Fairview Shores HOA engaged in a pattern of financial fraud, extortion, and retaliation, culminating in the deliberate destruction of my client's property." Oscar watched Margaret's face closely. No reaction. Damien clicked the remote. A grainy black and white video appeared on the screen. Two figures crept across Oscar's property. One carried a gas canister. The other struck a match. A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. Damien's voice sharpened. "We have security footage placing these individuals on Mr. Carter's property the night of the fire. Both have been identified as members of the Fairview Shores HOA board." Oscar's gaze stayed on Margaret. Her eyes narrowed. Damien advanced toward the judge's bench. "But there's more." He placed a document on the judge's desk. "This is a signed approval from Margaret Elwood, authorizing a payment to one of those individuals for consulting work. The payment was processed the day before the fire." Margaret's jaw twitched. "Ms. Elwood," the judge said, her gaze sharp, "do you have an explanation for this?" Margaret's attorney stood. "My client had no direct involvement in—" Damien cut him off. "You're saying she signed this document without knowing where the money was going?" Margaret's attorney hesitated. The judge's gaze sharpened. "Ms. Elwood—" Margaret's hands tightened on the table. For the first time, her mask slipped. "I have nothing to say," she said coolly. Damien's lips curled faintly. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. The HOA used intimidation and illegal fines to pressure homeowners into compliance. And when Mr. Carter refused, they escalated to criminal acts." The judge's eyes hardened. She glanced at Margaret's attorney. "I've seen enough." Oscar's chest tightened as the judge's voice rang through the room. "I find in favor of the plaintiff. Restitution will be paid in full. Furthermore, the assets of Fairview Shores HOA will be liquidated to cover damages." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Margaret's face paled. Oscar exhaled slowly. Damien's hand rested on his shoulder. "We got her," Damien said quietly. Oscar's eyes stayed on Margaret as she sat frozen at the table. The battle was over, and Oscar had won. 2 weeks later, Oscar stood at the edge of the golf course. The grass was freshly cut, and the early morning sun cast long shadows across the green. Jacob wandered up beside him, holding a coffee cup. "So," Jacob said, his tone light, "you really own it now?" Oscar smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's official. The HOA's assets cover the damages. That includes the golf course, the clubhouse, all of it." Jacob let out a low whistle. "I gotta say, never thought I'd see the day." Oscar's gaze drifted over the wide expanse of green. Neither did Margaret. Jacob chuckled. "So what's the plan? You gonna turn this into some exclusive resort?" Oscar's lips curled. "No, I'm opening to the public." Jacob's brow lifted. "Seriously? No fees, no memberships," Oscar said. "Just a place for the community to enjoy." Jacob shook his head. "You know that's going to drive Margaret crazy, right?" Oscar smiled faintly. "Good." In the distance, families were already walking the course. Kids ran along the paths, laughing. A couple sat on a bench, watching the sunrise. Oscar exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening. "Feels right," Jacob said quietly. Oscar nodded. "Yeah, it does." Jacob nudged him. "So you sticking around?" Oscar's gaze softened. "Maybe." Oscar was standing on the clubhouse patio when he heard someone behind him. He turned and saw Greg Turner standing near the door, looking hesitant. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "Hey!" Oscar's brow lifted. "What do you want?" Greg stepped closer. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Oscar's gaze narrowed. Greg's shoulders sagged. "I knew what Margaret was doing. I helped enforce those fines. I stood by when people complained. I didn't think it would go this far." Oscar's jaw tightened. "But you still let it happen." Greg's expression darkened with shame. "I know." He pulled out a folder and handed it to Oscar. "I pulled this from the HOA's records before the sheriff's department seized them. More financial reports. Fake vendor contracts. If Damien adds this to the case, it'll lock Margaret in." Oscar flipped through the folder. It was solid. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Greg said quietly, "but I want to help fix this." Oscar studied him. After a long moment, he extended his hand. Greg's eyes widened slightly before he shook it. "Tell the truth," Oscar said. "Let the community hear from you." Greg nodded. The first community meeting was held in the newly opened clubhouse. Rows of chairs were set up, and the room was packed with residents. Oscar stood near the front. Jacob was beside him. Greg took the microphone. His hands were shaking slightly. "I let Margaret control this place for too long," Greg said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm not proud of it, but it stops today." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Greg glanced toward Oscar. "Thanks to Oscar, we have a chance to rebuild this place into something better." Oscar stepped forward. "The golf course is open to everyone. No fees, no restrictions. This is your community now." A wave of applause filled the room. Jacob nudged him. "Look at you, neighborhood hero." Oscar smiled faintly. "Just doing what needed to be done." A week later, Oscar stood on the clubhouse balcony, looking out over the golf course. The sun was setting, casting golden light across the field. Jacob leaned on the railing beside him. "So, what's next?" Oscar smiled. "I'm sticking around for a while." Jacob grinned. "Glad to hear it." In the distance, a car pulled up. Margaret stepped out, flanked by 2 officers. Jacob's eyes widened. "Is that—" Oscar's smile sharpened. "The state's pressing charges." They watched as Margaret was led toward the car. She shot a look toward Oscar, her expression cold and hollow. Oscar's chest rose and fell steadily. For the first time in a long time, the weight was gone. "You actually did it," Jacob said. Oscar's smile softened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We did."